Portland, Oregon, is a city known for its progressive spirit, freedom of expression, and tolerance. Here, creative people, cutting-edge technology, and cultural trends harmoniously intertwine. Many people move to Portland to start life from scratch, find their place in the world, or immerse themselves in an atmosphere where everyone can be themselves. But despite its apparent idyll, even this city is not immune to tragedies caused by human passions, secrets, and lies. This story begins at one of the oldest universities in Portland, where life goes on as usual for students and teachers. In the early 2010s, James Henderson, a respected and well-known teacher whose professionalism and approach to teaching inspired students, worked in the literature department. Many considered him a model of academic culture and intellectual development. However, behind the facade of a successful teacher, there was a man leading a double life. James was a man with personal secrets that he carefully hid even from his closest friends. Although he identified himself as gay, his sexual orientation remained a secret to most people around him. He was reserved and balanced, which only enhanced his mysterious image in the eyes of his students and colleagues. No one could have guessed that soon this mask would begin to crack at the seams, and events would occur in his life that would shock everyone. The story centers on Sarah Miller, a young and energetic university student who was only 22 years old. She enrolled in the literature department to pursue her dream of becoming a writer. Sarah was an inspiring person with her passion for knowledge and the art of words. Her openness, intelligence, and determination made her a favorite of her teachers. But she was especially impressed by James Henderson, a man who became not only a mentor to her, but also someone more. Sarah felt an extraordinary connection with James from the very beginning. He, in turn, was also amazed by her talent and desire for self-improvement. At first, their communication was professional, but with each passing day it became more personal and profound. James, immersed in the contradictions between his inner desires and who he considered himself, began to become attached to Sarah. He could not explain to himself why he was so drawn to her, because his life before this was connected exclusively with men. It was this internal conflict that began the journey that would lead them both to tragic events. Dark shadows began to appear in Sarah and James's relationship, which would soon develop into a full-fledged obsession. But none of them could have imagined at that moment that a simple infatuation between a teacher and his student would develop into something much darker. Portland would soon witness events that would change the lives of Sarah, James, and their loved ones. James Henderson was a man respected in university circles. A tall, trim man, always with an impeccably groomed appearance. He taught literature at one of the oldest universities in Portland for more than a decade and was known for his lectures that inspired students not only to deeply study the subject, but also to philosophical reflections on life. At 35, James had achieved what many could only dream of. His career was on the rise. Students respected him for his sincere dedication to his profession, and colleagues valued him for his intellectual insight. But behind this outward image of a successful academic was a man with many personal problems. James was homosexual, but he carefully concealed his orientation. Unlike many of his colleagues and students who lived their lives openly in this progressive city, James preferred to keep his relationships in the shadows. He was old-fashioned and believed that personal life was not something that should be discussed within the walls of the university. However, his personal relationships were often chaotic and short-lived, which only increased his feelings of loneliness. His partners were usually people from a completely different sphere, men he dated secretly to preserve his reputation and career. This double life, filled with fear of exposure, created a constant tension inside him. Deep down, James knew that his sexual orientation was one of the factors he could not fully accept. He was a master of disguise and knew how to hide his feelings, which made him an even more mysterious figure for those around him. Sarah Miller, a 22-year-old sophomore, was the complete opposite of James. She was outgoing, energetic, and ambitious. Growing up in a small town in southern Oregon, Sarah always dreamed of moving to the big city to realize her talents and prove that she was capable of more. Upon entering Portland State University, she quickly became one of the best students in her class, thanks not only to her intelligence but also to her passion for literature. Her appearance also attracted attention. Average height, long brown hair that always looked carelessly styled, large green eyes full of curiosity and inspiration. But behind her bright appearance there was some inner fragility. Sarah was going through an identity crisis. She was looking for her place in the world, but she could not always find the answer to the question of what exactly she wanted from life. She was emotionally vulnerable and easily attached to people who seemed wise and experienced to her. James became such a figure in her life. They first met at one of the seminars on modern literature. From the very beginning, they began exchanging views, discussing different books and writers. James noticed her unusual passion for literature, which distinguished her from other students. Sarah was amazed by his deep erudition and ability to make the audience think. At first, their communication was purely academic. Sarah often asked questions after lectures, and James enjoyed discussing topics with her that went beyond the curriculum. He saw her not just as a student, but as a young, talented person to whom he could share some of his life experience. And although their relationship seemed innocent at first, James gradually began to feel something more. At first, he himself did not understand what was happening, but soon he realized that he was drawn to Sarah. She was young, energetic, and full of life, exactly what he was missing in his own life, filled with secrets. For Sarah, James was a mentor, someone who helped her find answers to questions she couldn't solve on her own. Over time, however, her affection for him began to become more personal as well. She admired his intelligence and maturity, but increasingly, she found that James was more important to her than just a teacher. This professional interest quickly developed into something more emotional, which soon led to the beginning of their complex and dangerous relationship. But if for Sarah this relationship seemed something new and intriguing, for James it became a real test. He knew that he was violating his own principles by getting involved in such a personal relationship with a young student. In addition, his homosexual orientation created even more confusion inside him. James had never been with women, and perhaps that is why he felt that his attachment to Sarah was something abnormal that went against his inner convictions. This duality, his attraction to a woman and his awareness of his orientation, was creating an internal conflict within him that only grew stronger over time. He tried to justify his feelings, convincing himself that it was just a temporary infatuation. But the more time they spent together, the more his attachment to Sarah became an obsession. His mind refused to accept what his heart had already accepted, that this student had become much more than just a student for him. Ultimately, their relationship becomes a series of emotional ups and downs that lead to fatal consequences. The secrets they kept from each other will soon come to the surface, changing their lives forever. Their first encounter took place during one of James's lectures in her second-year modern literature course. Sarah, like many students, had heard of his reputation before joining the course. James was known not only for his deep knowledge of the subject, but also for his ability to engage students in discussions, making each lecture rich and interesting. He didn't just read material from textbooks, but helped his audience see something more in the book's ideas that could change their thinking and understanding of the world. When Sarah walked into the classroom for the first time, she immediately noticed how James stood out from the other teachers. Unlike most, he didn't try to stick to formalities. There was something more to his teaching style, a deep, internal passion for what he was teaching. He was a man who lived for literature, and that energy was transmitted to his students. At first, Sarah kept her distance like many of her classmates, but she soon realized that she had something to say beyond the lecture material, and this brought them closer. One of the first workshops was about Virginia Woolf. James had a way of taking works and presenting them in such a way that they became not just texts, but challenges that demanded deep thought. He asked questions that had no right or wrong answers, only personal interpretations. This approach especially appealed to Sarah, who liked to look at things from a different angle. That day, the discussion turned to her favorite Woolf novel, Mrs. Dalloway. When James asked about how the novel reflected the idea of internal struggle, Sarah couldn't help herself. She raised her hand and began to talk about her interpretation. Her thoughts were bold and innovative, describing the connections between the disparate parts of the plot and Woolf's exploration of self-awareness. Her answers were so profound that for a moment the room fell silent. All eyes were on her. James was impressed too. He hadn't expected to hear such a mature and well-reasoned point of view from a second-year student. Sarah wasn't just repeating the course materials. She was consciously analyzing the text, making unexpected conclusions and building logical chains. He noted her thoughts and decided to remember her name. From that moment on, the first spark arose between them, a kind of mutual respect based on an intellectual level. After the lecture, James invited her to stay for a discussion. It was the first time they had met alone. He wanted to know more about what had led her to think so deeply. Sarah, though a little nervous, felt excited that her work and thoughts were being noticed by a professor she respected. Their conversation was long and rich. They discussed not only Woolf, but also her other favorite authors, Tolstoy, Joyce, as well as contemporary writers who occupied her mind. James was surprised by how mature and thoughtful this young student was. Her knowledge and appreciation of literature went beyond the usual curriculum. He felt something more in their conversations, not just an interest in her thoughts, but a personal connection. He saw in her something he himself lacked, a freshness, an openness to the world, and a willingness to seek answers to difficult questions. With every word she spoke, his interest in her only grew. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to stay after class more often to continue discussions with James. He was glad to have her there, though he tried to remain professional at first. His admiration for her intelligence and her passion for literature grew, and soon that admiration began to turn into something more personal. James, who had always been cautious in his relationships with his students, sensed that with Sarah the situation was different. Her company was pleasant, her thoughts inspiring, her energy infectious. For the first time in a long time, he felt a real connection that was not pretense. Sarah, in turn, began to reach out to James. He became more than just a mentor to her. He became someone she could trust. She saw him not just as a teacher, but as a friend whose thoughts and advice helped her grow. Her affection grew with each passing day, although she herself did not fully understand why. James seemed so smart and mature to her that she did not even notice how this affection gradually grew into something more. One day, after another lecture, they lingered in his office. The discussion went beyond literature, and Sarah began to talk about her life, about how difficult it was for her as a child, how she felt like an outsider in her small town, and how studying at the university was her only chance to escape the routine. James listened attentively, feeling an increasing emotional rapprochement with her. He understood that their conversation had gone beyond the academic framework, but he could not stop. This conversation became a turning point in their relationship. From that day on, their meetings became regular, and their conversations became more and more personal. James began to feel a strange attraction to Sarah, although his mind constantly tried to reject this feeling. He was homosexual. His relationships with men always seemed to him the only possible option, but for some reason Sarah awakened new feelings in him that he could not control. He did not understand whether it was admiration for her youth, her intelligence, or something more, but the fact remained. He was infatuated with her. Sarah, in turn, trusted James more and more. She told him about her experiences, her lack of self-confidence, and her fears about the future. For her, he became not just a teacher, but also someone who could understand her inner torment. This connection, which they began to build on the basis of intellectual admiration for each other, quickly developed into an emotional attachment that neither James nor Sarah could control. But with each passing day, their relationship became more and more complicated. James knew he was going too far, but he couldn't stop. His obsession with Sarah was beginning to crowd out everything else in his life, and Sarah, without even realizing it, was becoming more and more immersed in this complicated relationship. After weeks of intense conversation and thought-sharing, the relationship between James and Sarah began to change. What began as intellectual fascination and admiration for each other gradually turned into something more, a connection that defied explanation. But even so, for a long time, neither of them realized that their relationship went beyond the standard interactions between teacher and student. They both valued their friendship, but they didn't notice how it was quietly evolving into something deeper and more complex. James, who was an experienced and knowledgeable man, had long resisted his inner feelings. His mind and logic screamed at him that their interactions should remain at the level of academic exchange. But his heart said otherwise. For the first time in years, he felt alive in Sarah's presence. She was more than just a student. She was a light that had suddenly burst into his measured and often gloomy life. One evening, when they stayed again after a lecture to discuss her thesis, the atmosphere between them changed. The room was quiet, the lights were dimmed, and the conversations began to move away from literature and toward a more personal level. Sarah told James about her childhood, how she had always felt like an outsider to her family and friends. Her parents, strict people, did not understand her passion for art and literature, and she often felt alone. University became her escape, a place where she could be herself, and James became not just a teacher, but someone who understood her. James, sensing her emotional vulnerability, began to share his own secrets. He told her about his struggles with his own identity, how his sexual orientation had always been something he hid from everyone, including his loved ones. He talked about his unsuccessful love life, how his relationships with men had always been short-lived and frustrating. His confessions created an emotional intimacy between them that could no longer be ignored. At that moment, something clicked inside them both. In the silence of the room, full of unspoken words and invisible boundaries, their conversations became more and more frank. James, struggling internally, became increasingly aware that he was attached to Sarah not only as a teacher or mentor. His feelings for her were more complex than he was willing to admit. It was a completely new and frightening sensation for him. He had never felt anything like this for a woman, but his emotional connection to Sarah grew with each passing day. Sarah, in turn, began to notice changes in her feelings. For her, James was not just a mentor or a teacher. He was someone for whom she felt real affection. But this affection was not ordinary friendship or gratitude. With each passing day, her thoughts became more and more filled with James. She found in him what she had been searching for all her life: understanding, respect, and emotional support. She could not imagine what her life would be like without him, but her feelings were confused. She did not fully understand what this affection was: love, respect, or something else. At one of their regular meetings in the university library, they again plunged into a long conversation. This time, the topic was far from academic issues. They talked about life, their dreams and fears. At some point, a long pause reigned between them. Sarah, looking at James for the first time, saw in him not just a teacher but a man who attracted her. She felt her heart beat faster. This was a new moment for her, which she could not fully explain. She did not plan to fall in love with James, but her feelings were becoming more and more obvious. James, noticing her confused look, felt the tension in the air. In that moment, he realized that something more than just communication had happened between them. He saw how Sarah looked at him differently than before. He knew that her feelings for him had changed, and it scared him. Scared him because he himself had experienced something similar. But despite this inner fear, James couldn't back down. He was so consumed by this new emotion that he allowed himself to give in to it. He approached Sarah, their eyes met, and in that moment, something that had been brewing inside them for a long time emerged. The mutual attraction that they had been trying to ignore for so long finally burst forth. It was a moment that changed them both. For the first time, they crossed that invisible line that separated them as a teacher and a student. They both knew that this step was wrong, but they could not stop. Their emotions, which had been building up for weeks, took over. This moment was the beginning of a relationship that would soon completely take over their lives. In the following days, their meetings became more personal. They began to see each other not only at the university, but also outside of it. James invited Sarah to a cafe where they could spend hours discussing literature, life, and then their feelings. They hid their meetings from colleagues and friends, realizing that if someone found out about their relationship, it could lead to serious consequences. But despite all the dangers, they could not stop. Their connection grew stronger, and with each passing day they sank deeper into this whirlpool of feelings. Sarah felt she had found in James someone who understood her on a deeper level than anyone had ever done before. He was not only a mentor to her, but a lover, a friend, a person with whom she could be herself. She had never imagined that this affair would ever backfire on her. It was something magical to her, something she had dreamed of her whole life. James, for his part, was completely caught up in the relationship. He knew he was breaking every rule imaginable, but he couldn't stop his feelings. He became obsessed with Sarah, her youth, her passion, her devotion. But with that came fear that this relationship could ruin his life. As their relationship deepened, the boundaries between the professional and the personal became increasingly blurred. James and Sarah no longer hid their feelings from each other, although they tried to carefully disguise their meetings from colleagues and students. The university was their working environment, and they knew that if anyone found out about their relationship, it would have disastrous consequences for their reputation. But despite these concerns, their attachment became more intense and obsessive. Something had appeared in their lives that they could not control. For Sarah, this relationship became something of an anchor. She had always felt like an outsider in the university environment, among other students who seemed to her more confident, independent, and goal-oriented. But in her relationship with James, she found someone who truly understood her inner world, her fears and ambitions. He was not just a mentor to her, but also a kind of spiritual companion who shared her passion for literature, art, and the search for meaning in life. With each passing day, she became more and more attached to him, not noticing that this attachment was becoming an obsession. Their relationship was fraught with contradictions. On the one hand, James was a source of inspiration and support for Sarah, but on the other, he was increasingly beginning to reveal his own fears and insecurities. His double life as a teacher and lover was beginning to weigh on him. On the one hand, he wanted to maintain his professional reputation and distance, but on the other, he was drawn to Sarah in a way he had never been drawn to anyone before. He began to realize that their relationship was becoming something more than he was prepared to accept. One day, a few months into their affair, Sarah noticed that James had become more distant. He stopped responding to her texts as quickly as he used to, and their meetings became less frequent. Sarah was puzzled and began to worry that he was trying to distance himself from her. This was a real blow to her. James was her rock, her connection to the world, and losing that relationship seemed unthinkable. James, for his part, began to struggle with his inner demons. He found it increasingly difficult to balance two lives, one as a teacher who had to uphold professional and moral standards, and the other as a man immersed in a deep emotional connection with Sarah. He could no longer ignore the fact that his career and reputation were at risk. But the worst thing for him was not losing his job, but losing control over his own feelings. He realized that he was sinking deeper and deeper into this emotional vortex, and he was afraid that he would not be able to get out. However, despite all his efforts to distance himself from Sarah, he could not do so. Every time he thought he could end the relationship, he was drawn to her again. He found himself thinking about her, even when he was in lectures or meetings with colleagues. This obsession began to affect his behavior at university. He became more irritable. His colleagues began to notice that he was less focused, often missed important meetings, and became less sociable. Sarah, feeling James's withdrawal, began to feel truly anxious. He was constantly on her mind. She could no longer focus on her studies. Her grades began to slip, and she lost interest in other aspects of her life. Her friends began to notice that something was wrong. She stopped attending parties and social events that she used to enjoy. Instead, she spent hours at home waiting for a call or text from James. He became everything to her, and she could no longer imagine her life without him. This period of distance did not last long. Soon, James began to show interest in Sarah again, but on a different level. If before their meetings were more romantic, now they became more and more emotionally intense. James began to show signs of jealousy. He demanded more attention from Sarah than before, and often asked questions about who she spent time with, what she did when they were not together. He became more intrusive, although he himself did not want to admit it. One evening, when they met at a cozy cafe in downtown Portland, James suddenly started a conversation about their future. He asked a question that came as a shock to Sarah. "What's next for us?" It was the first time he had brought up the topic of their relationship in the long term. Before that, they had both avoided discussing the future, preferring to live in the present moment. But now James clearly wanted something more. Sarah, despite her shock, was prepared for this conversation. She had been thinking about the future with James for a long time and had even begun to imagine how they could live together. But the reality was much more complicated. James was her teacher, and if their relationship came to light, it could ruin not only his career, but also her own life. However, the moment he asked this question, all her fears and doubts faded into the background. She was ready to do anything for him. James, on the other hand, was becoming more and more immersed in his own fears. Although he had asked the question, he himself was not sure of the answer. He did not know if he could continue to live a double life, hiding his relationship with Sarah from everyone. He began to feel that he was losing control of his life. His love for Sarah, which initially seemed sincere and real to him, began to turn into an obsession. He began to see her not only as the object of his affection, but also as the source of all his internal contradictions. Sarah, despite all her internal worries, continued to believe that they could overcome any difficulties. For her, this relationship became the meaning of life, and she could not imagine how to live without James. But she did not understand that their relationship was becoming toxic. She did not notice how she was gradually losing herself in this relationship, adjusting to his mood and desires. Her life was increasingly concentrated around James, and she began to neglect everything else. With each meeting, James became more and more clingy and controlling. He began calling her more and more often, asking where she was and who she was spending time with. He found it difficult to accept that Sarah was a separate person, with her own interests in life. His fear of losing her began to develop into jealousy and attempts to control every aspect of her life. The situation escalated, and the relationship that began as genuine affection became increasingly tense and destructive. Thus, their romantic relationship, which began as genuine emotional attachment and mutual admiration, gradually turned into an obsession. James could no longer ignore his dependence on Sarah, and she could not imagine her life without him. The relationship began to consume them both, drawing them into a whirlpool of passion, fear, and uncertainty. As the relationship between James and Sarah continued to deepen, what seemed like small warning signs to outsiders, but to them, were easy to ignore. They were both caught up in passion, affection, and perhaps even the illusion that this was true love. However, over time, it became apparent that their relationship was beginning to lose the healthy dynamic they had hoped for. For James, already accustomed to living alone and in the shadows, his attachment to Sarah began to grow into an obsession. Every day without her presence felt empty and meaningless. He began checking her messages more and more often, expecting a response within minutes, and becoming irritated when she didn't respond as quickly as he wanted. He felt like his world revolved around her, a feeling that both terrified and attracted him. Sarah, for her part, was in a state of emotional dependence on James. She felt that without his support and attention, she would have a hard time finding her place at university and in life in general. He became not only a mentor and an object of affection, but also something of a compass guiding her through life. However, she increasingly felt that something was wrong. James began to show new, previously unknown aspects of his personality, aspects that left her feeling anxious and confused. One of the first warning signs was his constant desire to control her time and space. If before their meetings were filled with joy from communication, now James began to exercise control over how Sarah spent her time, especially outside of the university. He increasingly asked her questions. Where were you? Why didn't you answer right away? Who were you talking to? At first, Sarah attributed this to his care and desire to be close, but it soon became clear that this was a manifestation of jealousy and mistrust. Every time she stayed late at meetings with friends or attended classes without him, James began to get nervous and demand explanations. This worried her, but she did not dare to openly conflict. There were also warning signs in his behavior during their meetings. Whereas they had previously discussed literature and her future with enthusiasm and interest, their conversations now became more tense. James returned to the topic of their relationship more and more often, asking questions about her affection and love for him, questioning her fidelity. He began to talk about their future not in a romantic sense, but with notes of anxiety and control, as if he were afraid that she would leave him at any moment. One of the most striking examples was how he reacted to her new acquaintances. Sarah, like any student, had a social circle that included her friends and classmates. She often spent time with groups of students in the library or cafes, discussing projects and assignments. However, James began to show open jealousy when she mentioned other students, especially men. He could not hide his irritation and anger when he heard that she was spending time with other people. His jealousy knew no bounds. He would ask her about who was texting her even late at night, unaware that they could just be her friends or classmates. Sarah tried to maintain a balance between her relationship with James and her personal life, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Her friends began to notice that she was changing, becoming more withdrawn and distant. They saw her once bright and independent nature fading, giving way to a strange tension and anxiety. One of her closest friends, Alex, tried to talk to her about what was going on. He noticed that Sarah was spending less time with them and more time with James, which began to seem strange and abnormal. One evening, while he and Alex were sitting in a cafe, he decided to ask her a direct question. "Sarah, is everything okay? You haven't been yourself lately. You rarely show up for our meetings, and even when you do, you're all worked up. Do you want to talk about it?" His words cut to the quick, but Sarah couldn't open up to him. She still believed that her relationship with James was something unique that no one would understand. She answered evasively, claiming that everything was fine and that she was just studying a lot, but her answers did not convince Alex. Meanwhile, James began to lose control of his emotions even more. He became increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of Sarah leaving him or betraying him. He recalled moments when his past relationships had ended in breakups or betrayal and projected these fears onto Sarah. He increasingly panicked when she was not around. He felt like she belonged to him, and the thought of her finding someone else or leaving drove him crazy. Another red flag was his tendency to isolate Sarah from her social circle. He increasingly suggested that she spend time alone with him, avoiding her friends and classmates. He became more controlling when it came to her schedule and how she spent her free time. James suddenly began to impose his opinions on her career and studies, giving advice that Sarah found restrictive. He began to intrude into her personal space, demanding more and more of her attention and time, as if he were afraid that her independence would ruin their bond. Sarah felt like her life was gradually narrowing down to one person, James. She saw her friends less and less and spent more and more time with him, which created mixed feelings inside her. She loved James, but she was beginning to realize that their relationship was becoming something different than it had been at the beginning. Instead of joy and mutual support, she increasingly felt heaviness and tension. But even despite this, she could not just leave. Her emotional dependence on James had become so strong that the thought of parting seemed unbearable. One of the most disturbing incidents was how James reacted when he learned that Sarah was planning a weekend trip home to visit her parents. He began arguing with her, arguing that she could stay in Portland and spend the weekend with him. His arguments were illogical and his jealousy became apparent. He even went so far as to offer to accompany her, even though he knew it would be impossible. Sarah was taken aback by his behavior, but wanting to avoid conflict, she ultimately agreed to cut her trip short. The situation was gradually becoming unbearable for both of them. James was losing control of his emotions more and more, and Sarah, feeling pressure from him, began to distance herself more and more from her old life. But despite all these warning signs, they continued to reach out to each other, as if their connection was so strong that it was destroying them from the inside. However, these warning signs were only the beginning of what would soon develop into something darker and more dangerous. Their relationship began a downward spiral towards inevitable disaster, but neither James nor Sarah could have foreseen how devastating the consequences would be. James Henderson hid his sexual orientation from his colleagues, students, and even his closest friends for a long time. He carefully guarded his personal life, especially at university, where he tried to remain neutral and professional. At the same time, he had been in a relationship with a man named Thomas for several years. The relationship was quiet, secretive, and almost emotionless. It did not require any deep commitment or openness from James, which suited him perfectly. Thomas was several years older than James, reserved and independent. Their relationship seemed mutually beneficial and stable, until something arose that destroyed their delicate balance. Sarah. Her presence in James's life gradually began to crowd out everything else, including Thomas. He himself did not notice it at first, but Sarah occupied a lot more space in his heart and thoughts than he was willing to admit. James was deeply absorbed in his relationship with Sarah despite his internal contradictions. He still did not fully understand what exactly he felt for her. Was it love, admiration for her youth and passion, or was it an obsession? But he knew one thing. His thoughts about Sarah gradually began to crowd out everything else. It all started when James began seeing Thomas less. They began spending less time together, and James increasingly found excuses not to see him. Thomas was an intelligent and sensitive person, and he quickly noticed the changes in James's behavior. At first, he tried to ignore it, attributing it to stress from work or academic commitments, but over time, it became obvious that it was more than just work. James became secretive, irritable, and nervous, which was not typical of him before. One evening, Thomas suggested meeting at one of their favorite restaurants in downtown Portland. It was a place they always associated with comfort and fond memories, but this time the atmosphere was tense. James sat across from Thomas, nervously fiddling with his phone. His mind was far from this dinner. He was thinking about Sarah, what she was doing at that moment, and how soon they could see each other again. He wasn't even listening to Thomas trying to make conversation until he noticed his gaze. "James, can you even hear me?" Thomas finally asked, frowning slightly. His voice was patient, but at the same time there was pain in it. James winced and looked up, realizing that he had last listened to Thomas a few minutes ago. He sighed, trying to bring himself back to reality, but he didn't know what to say. "Sorry, Thomas, I'm just tired," James muttered, trying to find an explanation for his absence from the conversation. But Thomas knew it wasn't just tiredness. He could see clearly that James wasn't the same. Something had changed and it was bothering him. "I notice something is going on," Thomas said, softly but insistently. "You're different. You've become distant from me, and I don't believe it's just about work. There's something else, isn't there?" The question caught James off guard. He knew this moment would come sooner or later, but he still wasn't ready for the open conversation. He knew Thomas didn't deserve to be lied to, but the truth was more complicated than he was willing to admit, even to himself. James paused, wondering how to respond. Thomas waited patiently, not looking away. The moment seemed endless. Finally, James realized that he could no longer hide the truth. "There's someone else," he breathed, feeling the words weighing on his chest. It was hard to say, but even harder to live a constant lie. Thomas hadn't expected such a direct answer, although inside he had long felt that things were heading this way. He exhaled slowly and looked away, trying to comprehend what he had heard. "Who is she?" Thomas asked, although he already knew the answer. James had never shown interest in women before, and Thomas could not even imagine that the mysterious other could be a girl. "She's a student," James admitted, his voice shaking. "It started out as an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen, but now it's gotten out of hand." James's words, despite his attempt to explain his feelings, were like a knife to Thomas's heart. He couldn't understand how the man he had shared so many years with could betray him like this. And although Thomas wanted to be angry or make a scene, he simply felt empty. "A student?" Thomas asked, still not believing what was happening. "You realize this isn't just a personal issue, James. This could ruin not only our relationship, but your career as well." The words hit James harder than he expected. He knew Thomas was right. All this time, he had tried to keep his feelings for Sarah a secret, not only because it was morally wrong, but also because he was afraid of the consequences for his career. But now that his relationship with Sarah had reached a new level, he couldn't think of any rational consequences. "I know," James said quietly, "but I can't stop. I tried, Thomas. I tried to finish it, but I couldn't." Thomas looked at James with disbelief and disappointment. He didn't know how to react to this confession. On the one hand, he loved James and didn't want to lose him, but on the other hand, he felt that their relationship was beyond repair. "So, this is the end for us?" Thomas asked, looking straight into James's eyes. There was no longer anger in his voice, only sadness and weariness. James couldn't answer right away. He knew it was best for both of them, but he couldn't bring himself to say the words. Thomas had been an important part of his life for many years, and losing him would mean losing the stability he had grown accustomed to. "I don't know," James finally whispered. "I just don't know what's going to happen next." But Thomas already knew that the answer was clear. He nodded, trying to maintain his composure, and slowly stood up from the table. This moment was perhaps the most painful for both of them. He did not want to continue this conversation any longer. He felt that words were no longer necessary. Everything had already been said. "Take care, James," Thomas said as he left, leaving James alone in the restaurant. When the door closed behind him, James felt empty. He knew he had done the right thing, but it didn't bring him any relief. Conflicting emotions raged inside him, the pain of his breakup with Thomas and the unquenchable passion for Sarah. All he knew was that his life was now even more complicated and confusing. Sarah didn't know about Thomas or the breakup. James didn't feel the need to share these details with her. He thought it didn't matter, because his world was now centered on Sarah. But his breakup with Thomas was the beginning of the end of his quiet, orderly life and the beginning of a destructive path that led to disaster. Now James was free from the old relationship, but this freedom brought with it even more problems. His feelings for Sarah became more and more obsessive, and he could no longer control his actions. Gradually, the secret relationship between James and Sarah began to slip beyond their personal meetings. What they had so carefully hidden from others began to slowly emerge at the university. At first, it was just small things, glances that seemed too long for the average student and teacher, their disappearances into the corridors after lectures, and sometimes too frequent and noticeable personal conversations. But what began as small suspicions gradually turned into a topic of discussion among students and James's colleagues. The university, despite its openness and progressiveness, was still a place where rumors spread quickly. It took Sarah a while to realize that their relationship was becoming the focus of attention. She was too caught up in the very fact of her connection with James and completely immersed in these emotions. For her, James was the center of her universe, and she did not notice that their unusual behavior was starting to raise questions. However, her classmates began to notice that Sarah was communicating with them less and less, was often absent from meetings, and rarely shared her experiences as before. This made her stand out from the group. One of the first to sense that something was wrong was Sarah's friend Laura. They had once been inseparable, discussing books, plans for the future, and even their personal relationships. But as Sarah became closer to James, she began to distance herself from Laura. Laura tried to figure out what was going on. At first, she thought that Sarah was simply overwhelmed with her studies or personal affairs, but soon she began to suspect that there was more to it. She noticed that Sarah often stayed after James's lectures and sometimes disappeared with him for several hours. One day, Laura decided to have a direct conversation. It was in a cafe near the campus, where they used to hang out. Laura suggested that Sarah meet to discuss preparation for the session, but the conversation quickly turned to personal topics. Sarah was tense and distracted, as if her thoughts were far away. Laura tried to strike up a frank conversation. "Sarah, you've been so different lately," Laura began, looking her straight in the eye. "I can see that you've become distant from all of us. You don't share your thoughts anymore, and you barely communicate with us. What's going on?" Sarah tried to smile and deflect the conversation, but Laura didn't back down. "I've noticed you spending time with Professor Henderson. Everyone's been talking about it," she continued. "Is it true? Is there something going on between you?" These words made Sarah shudder inside. She thought that no one could guess about their relationship, but now it became clear that their relationship had become the subject of rumors. She felt her heart begin to beat faster, but tried to remain calm. "No, Laura, it's just a rumor," Sarah lied, trying to sound confident. "We just work together on a lot of projects. He's my mentor, and I learn a lot from him." Laura wasn't sure whether to believe her or not, but she decided to leave the conversation at that. However, there was still a sense of unease inside her. She knew that something serious was going on behind this relationship. Soon rumors about James and Sarah began to spread among the students. Whispers, gossip in the hallways, discussions in groups, all this gradually accumulated. Some students said that they saw them together outside the university. Others claimed that Sarah had become James's favorite and that he treated her in a special way. At first, these were just guesses, but over time, suspicions grew. James, too, began to feel pressure from his colleagues. Although he tried to be discreet, His meetings with Sarah became more frequent and longer, which could not go unnoticed. Colleagues began to notice that he was spending more time with Sarah than with other students. Some professors began to wonder what was going on, especially when they began to notice that Sarah was getting better grades despite her attendance and activity in other courses declining. One such professor was Dr. Richardson, the head of James's literature department. He had always treated Henderson with respect, valuing his expertise and teaching success. But lately, Richardson had noticed that James had changed. His lectures were less structured, he often stayed late for meetings, and when someone mentioned Sarah Miller, Henderson seemed noticeably tense. Dr. Richardson decided to discuss the situation with James alone. One day after a departmental meeting, he invited James into his office. James sensed that this would be a difficult conversation, but he hoped that he could convince Richardson that everything was all right. When they sat down in the office, Richardson began with a general discussion of the work of the department and James's achievements, but soon moved on to the main point. "James, I've noticed that you've been working very closely with one of your students, Sarah Miller," Richardson began, looking at him with a serious expression. "I don't want to interfere with your teaching methods, but there are certain boundaries that are important to respect. Some colleagues and students have begun to suggest that there's more to the two of you than just mentoring." The words hit James hard, even though he tried to remain calm. He knew his relationship with Sarah couldn't remain a secret forever, but he hoped he could somehow explain what was happening. "Dr. Richardson, I understand what you're saying," James began, choosing his words carefully. "But I can assure you that my relationship with Sarah is strictly professional. She's a talented student, and I'm simply trying to help her grow academically." But Richardson didn't look convinced. He'd seen too much in his career to ignore the obvious. He sighed and continued, "James, I appreciate your work and I know you've always been a good teacher. But rumors of such things could harm not only your reputation, but also the university. I ask you to be careful and rethink your priorities. This could end badly for everyone involved." James left Richardson's office feeling anxious and confused. He knew the situation was getting out of control. On the one hand, he was attracted to Sarah and couldn't give up the relationship, but on the other hand, he knew he was risking his career. He began to realize that rumors and suspicions were beginning to affect his work, his reputation, and even his mental state. Sarah also began to feel pressure. Her classmates began to avoid her, and some even openly discussed her relationship with James. They said that she was getting privileges because of her closeness to the professor, that she was using James to improve her grades. These conversations became another reason why Sarah became more and more withdrawn. Her world seemed to be crumbling. She could no longer walk the halls of the university without feeling judgmental glances. Gradually, her academic performance began to decline. She attended classes less and less often, and her grades in other subjects began to decline. The teachers who had previously respected her now treated her with suspicion, and her classmates became increasingly distant. Sarah was in a state of constant stress and anxiety. The only person who could support her was James, but he himself began to become increasingly immersed in his own problems. Thus, their secret relationship, which once seemed special and meaningful to them, slowly began to destroy everything around it. The rumors continued to spread, and the pressure on both of them increased. James realized that their relationship could no longer be hidden, and that the consequences could be catastrophic for both his career and Sarah's life. James's obsession with Sarah was slowly reaching its peak. What had started as a deep emotional connection and mutual admiration had turned into a dark, destructive feeling that was literally eating him up from the inside. James could no longer think rationally, control his emotions, or control his actions. Sarah had become the center of his universe, and he felt like he couldn't breathe without her. He was convinced that he not only loved her, but needed her like oxygen. It all started with small things. At first, he started showing obsessive care. which at first glance could seem sincere and romantic. He would text Sarah every morning, wishing her a good day, and in the evening, asking how her day was. But the more their relationship deepened, the more James began to feel anxious when Sarah did not respond to his messages immediately. He began to text her more often, checking her social media, asking who she was talking to and where she was. Sarah, initially flattered by his attention, soon began to feel uncomfortable. James was becoming too clingy, and his jealousy was becoming more and more obvious. One day, when she was late meeting friends after class, James could not contain his anxiety and anger. He sent her dozens of messages, asking where she was and why she was taking so long to respond. When she finally saw them, her heart sank with anxiety. She knew this was not normal behavior, but she was afraid to bring it up with him, afraid that he would take it as rejection. Meetings with James also changed. Whereas before they discussed literature, her future, and academic success, now their conversations increasingly turned into showdowns. James began asking too many questions about her life outside of their time together. He wanted to know who she talked to, where she went, and even what she thought. Every time she mentioned other students, especially men, James immediately became cold and suspicious. One day during a lecture, Sarah casually asked her classmate John for help in discussing a project. It was a normal interaction between students, but James, watching from the lectern, could not contain his anger. The thought that Sarah might be interested in someone else began to swirl in his mind. He could not understand that such an interaction meant nothing more than academic communication. His inner fears began to crowd out any rational arguments. After the lecture, he approached Sarah with a stony expression and asked, "Why were you talking to him?" Sarah looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. "You mean John? We were just discussing the project. It doesn't mean anything," she tried to explain. But James was adamant. "I don't like the way you talk to him," he said, jealousy evident in his voice. "He looks at you like he likes you." Sarah felt a wave of tension wash over her. She felt that James was overreacting to the situation. But deep down, she was afraid of losing him and didn't know what to do. "James, are you serious? This is just a school project," she replied, trying to reassure him. But James couldn't let go of the thought. He felt betrayed even though there was no reason to be. In his mind, jealousy was turning into something more, a fear of loss. He was convinced that if he didn't control Sarah, she would leave him, and that would ruin his life. With each passing day, this jealousy and fear grew stronger. James began to control every aspect of her life. He insisted that she spend as much time with him as possible, so that she had no chance to meet other people. He began showing up at her house unannounced, waiting for her to come out so he could take her to dinner or a meeting. Sarah tried to resist, explaining that she needed space, but James would not listen. One evening, when Sarah returned home from meeting friends, she found James standing at her door. His face was tense and his eyes were full of worry. She sighed, knowing that she was in for another tense conversation. "What are you doing here, James?" she asked, opening the door. "I was just worried," he replied with a dark tone. "You weren't answering my messages." Sarah was already used to such situations, but this time her patience ran out. "I was with friends, James. I need space. You can't control every minute of my life." She sounded tired but firm. These words caused a flash of emotion in James. He felt like his world was falling apart. For him, Sarah was the only person who could fill his emptiness, and the thought of her leaving or being with someone else literally drove him crazy. "You don't understand how I feel about you," he said, desperation in his voice. "I can't lose you, Sarah." But his words did not calm her down. She felt trapped, not knowing what to do. She still loved James, but his obsession began to destroy her inner world. She could no longer breathe freely. It seemed to her that her every step was being controlled and judged. Over the next few weeks, Their relationship continued to deteriorate. James became even more clingy and suspicious. He began accusing Sarah of cheating on him, even though there was no basis for this. He became enraged at the slightest hint that she was communicating with other people, and his moods became unpredictable. He could be tender and loving one moment and cold and distant the next. Sarah began to seriously consider breaking up, but the thought that James might not be able to handle it scared her. She didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time, she couldn't stand his control any longer. She felt trapped, not knowing how to get out of this situation. Meanwhile, James was becoming increasingly lost in his thoughts. He became paranoid, convinced that Sarah would soon leave him. He couldn't concentrate on his work, his lectures became chaotic, and his colleagues began to notice his strange behavior. His obsession with Sarah left him with no room for a normal life. All his thoughts revolved around her, and this feeling consumed him more and more. One evening when they met again at her apartment, James couldn't contain himself. For the first time, their conversation turned into a serious argument. Sarah tried to explain to him that she needed more space and freedom, but James perceived this as a threat to their relationship. He started shouting, accusing her of wanting to leave him and going to another man. His anger was so strong that Sarah felt real fear. "James, stop! You can't treat me like this," she said, stepping back. "I'm not your property, and if you can't understand that, I don't know how we can continue." These words seemed to break James. He was unable to control his emotions. He grabbed her hand, his eyes burning with despair and anger. "You can't leave me," he whispered, squeezing her wrist harder than he intended. "You're all I have." Sarah felt pain and fear. She realized that this was not just a fight. It was a sign that their relationship had gone too far. James's obsession had become dangerous, and she could no longer ignore it. From that moment on, Sarah began to seriously think about the fact that she needed to end this relationship before it was too late. After James lost control of his emotions and became physically aggressive for the first time, Sarah realized that the situation had become truly dangerous. She could no longer ignore the warning signs that surrounded her. Her entire life, which had once seemed normal, was rapidly falling apart under the pressure of James and his growing obsession. Fear began to grow inside Sarah, invisible to those around her, but literally eating her up from the inside. However, she still did not know what to do. Every step seemed risky to her. Any action could lead to even greater escalation. James, after their argument, also found himself in a state of deep confusion. He knew he had lost control, that he had gone too far, but he could do nothing about it. He felt like he was falling further and further into the abyss. His mind was full of images of Sarah, her face, her voice, her touch. He could think of nothing else except the possibility that she might leave him, and this thought was driving him crazy. The day after their argument, James tried calling Sarah several times, but she didn't answer. Each missed call only fueled his anxiety. Inwardly, he knew he should apologize for his behavior, but deep down, he still believed that Sarah was wrong. He was afraid of losing her, and this fear was so strong that he was willing to do anything to keep her close. Sarah, meanwhile, had decided to cut off all contact with James for a few days. She needed time to think, cool off, and sort out her feelings. She went to her parents' home in suburban Portland, hoping to disconnect from all the problems associated with college and James for a few days. But despite her decision, she couldn't completely relax. Her mind was constantly spinning with thoughts about how James would take her silence. She was afraid of his reaction and wasn't sure if her attempt to distance herself would be safe. James, however, began to lose patience when his calls and messages were not answered. He arrived at her apartment, but no one answered the door. He knocked and rang the doorbell, but it was empty. This only increased his anxiety. He did not know where she was, and this drove him to the edge. The most terrible scenarios began to appear in his head. He began to convince himself that Sarah had left him, that she had found someone else. Every time he imagined her with another man, he was overcome with rage. He tried to contact her again through social media, but she continued to ignore his messages. He couldn't understand why she was acting this way and decided that he had to find a way to meet her in person. It became an obsession for him. A few days after Sarah returned to the city, James could no longer contain himself. He was standing outside her house late at night when she was returning from work. Sarah sensed his presence before she saw him. As she approached her door, she noticed his silhouette on the dark street. At that moment, her heart sank with fear, but she gathered all her courage and approached him. "James, what are you doing here?" she asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "Why haven't you answered my calls?" His voice was cold, but there was desperation in it. "Are you avoiding me, Sarah?" Sarah froze, trying to find the right words. She felt that every phrase could fuel his anger even more. She did not want to provoke him, but at the same time she knew that their relationship had to end. "I needed time to think," she replied carefully. "I feel like we need to take a break, James. I can't do this anymore." The words seemed to pierce him. He had a hard time containing his emotions, trying not to show how deeply her words had hurt him. In his mind, her pause meant the end of their relationship, and this thought consumed his mind. He couldn't accept it. "A pause? What does that mean, Sarah?" His voice was tense. "You can't just leave. We can't just break up. I love you." Sarah knew the conversation was taking a dangerous turn. She could see how James was ready to destroy everything around him to keep her. But in that moment, she realized that she had to be firm, even if it meant pain for both of them. "James, I can't live like this anymore," she said, feeling despair welling up inside her. "You've become too controlling. I feel trapped. This isn't what I want." These words caused an explosion of emotions in James. He couldn't believe that she was saying this. It sounded like a betrayal to him, as if all their moments together, their feelings, were destroyed in an instant. "A trap?" he cried. "I thought you loved me. I do everything for us, to be with you. How can you just throw it away?" He approached Sarah, and in that moment she felt real fear. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She realized that James had lost control of himself, and that any attempt to calm him down would only make things worse. "I don't want to lose you, Sarah." His voice was almost a whisper, full of desperation. "You're the only one I have." These words, instead of evoking pity in her, only increased her fear. She saw how his obsession had reached the point of no return. For him, this was not just love. It was a complete absorption of her life. "James, this isn't love," she said, trying to sound as gentle as she could. "This is obsession. You have to understand that." But her words didn't reach him. James couldn't comprehend that his love had become an obsession. For him, this relationship was the only thing that mattered, and he couldn't imagine his life without Sarah. He took a step forward, but Sarah stepped back sharply. "Don't come near me," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm serious, James. I need time." These words seemed to explode something inside him. His face became gloomy and his eyes filled with anger. He did not understand how his love could be rejected. "You don't understand, Sarah," he said through clenched teeth. "You can't just leave." The phrase sounded like a threat. Sarah froze, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. She quickly took the keys out of her bag and began to open the door. "I have to go," she whispered, feeling her hands shaking. But before she could enter the apartment, James grabbed her hand. He held it tightly, but not so tightly that it hurt. It was a gesture of desperation, not aggression. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice full of pain. "Please." Sarah broke free of his grip and ran into the apartment, slamming the door in his face. She heard him standing outside the door, begging her to open it, but she couldn't. Her fear was at its peak, and she knew this relationship couldn't continue. Inside the apartment, she leaned against the door, her heart pounding and tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know what to do next. She loved James, but his obsession had become too much to bear. She couldn't live in constant fear that he would lose control again. From that moment on, Sarah decided that their relationship had to end, otherwise it could lead to irreparable consequences. She understood that James would not be able to just let her go, and this was what scared her the most. From the moment Sarah closed the door on James, her life changed completely. She could no longer live the way she had before, where she had previously tried to balance her studies, relationships, and social obligations. Her entire reality now became one of constant fear. She realized that breaking up with James was inevitable, but she also knew that it would not be an easy way out. Anxiety was brewing inside her, that he would not leave her alone, that their relationship had turned into something much more dangerous than just unrequited love. James couldn't accept that their relationship was over. He saw it as a betrayal, a rejection of everything they had experienced together. For him, Sarah wasn't just a part of his life. She was his life itself. Her rejection destroyed his inner world, and he could no longer think rationally. The obsession turned into an obsession that he was ready to follow to the end, not realizing that his actions were wrong and even criminal. In the early days after the incident at the door, James tried to keep in touch with Sarah through texts and calls, but she ignored him. Her phone was constantly ringing off the hook with calls she couldn't bring herself to take. She was in a battle inside. She still felt like she had to help James, but she was also afraid of him. She knew his behavior had gone beyond what was normal, and now every call from him felt threatening. She didn't respond to his messages, and sometimes she didn't even read them, afraid of what they might say. James, receiving no answer, began to panic. He couldn't understand how Sarah could just leave him. He tried calling her again and again, texting her, begging her to come back. The messages became more and more desperate, sometimes filled with love, sometimes with anger and reproach. He couldn't cope with the idea that she didn't want to be with him anymore. "Sarah, please answer me. We need to talk. I know you're angry, but I love you. I'll do anything to make this right." The messages came every day, but as she didn't respond, the tone of the messages changed. "Why are you ignoring me? You betrayed me, Sarah. I don't deserve this. You make me suffer, and I don't understand why." Over time, James became more assertive. He couldn't stand her silence any longer. He began showing up at her apartment, hoping she would open the door and let him explain. He spent hours standing outside her door, watching for her to show up. But Sarah avoided him, knowing that any interaction with James would only make things worse. One evening, as Sarah was returning from class, she saw James again, standing near her house. He made no move to approach her, just stood there and stared. That look haunted her nightmares, a look of desperation mixed with anger. She couldn't believe that the man she once loved could change so much. This James was a stranger. "James, you can't stand here," she said when she finally spoke. "I've said it all. We need to move on." But he just shook his head, his eyes full of pain. "I can't do this without you, Sarah. I can't." His voice was hoarse and quiet, as if he was on the verge of breaking down. Sarah felt a wave of terror. She didn't know what to do. Every time she tried to explain to him that their relationship was over, he refused to listen, as if it was something unacceptable that he couldn't accept. She felt like he lived in another world where her words didn't matter. After this incident, Sarah began to take extra security measures. She changed the route she took to university, avoided her usual places, and tried not to be alone in the evenings. But the fear was always there. She began to notice James everywhere, in the cafe where she liked to have coffee with friends, or at the entrance to the library. Sometimes she caught his gaze through the window when he was standing in front of her apartment. It was like a nightmare from which there was no escape. His presence became more and more intrusive with each passing day. He began following her. No matter where she went, he was always there. He stood at the entrance to the university when she left after classes. He showed up at the cafe where she met her friends. Sometimes he stood on the opposite side of the street watching her go about her business. These were not aggressive actions, but they scared Sarah to the core. One evening, when Sarah decided to have dinner with her friends at one of the restaurants in the city, she saw James again, sitting at one of the tables. His presence no longer seemed accidental. She felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that these were no longer just casual encounters. This was real stalking. Sarah's friends began to notice her strange behavior. She became nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, and increasingly avoided talking about her personal life. They didn't know all the details of her relationship with James, but they noticed that something was clearly wrong. "Sarah, are you okay?" Laura asked her one evening as they sat in a cafe. "You look like someone is stalking you." These words made Sarah shudder. She knew that she could no longer hide the truth. She had to share with someone what was happening. "It's James," she finally admitted, her voice quiet and full of fear. "He won't leave me alone. I've tried to break things off, but he won't listen." Laura was shocked. She couldn't believe that the man they all knew as a calm and intelligent teacher could do such a thing. "You have to tell the police," Laura insisted, her eyes serious. "This isn't okay, Sarah. You can't continue to live in such fear." But Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to escalate the situation, afraid that it might provoke James to even more radical actions. She still hoped that he would calm down and understand that their relationship was truly over. But as the days passed, the situation only worsened. James began showing up more frequently, and his messages became more desperate and alarming. He begged her to come back, promising to change his behavior. But within hours, his tone would change dramatically. He would accuse her of betraying him, of using him and abandoning him when he was at his most vulnerable. One night, as Sarah was trying to sleep, her phone suddenly started ringing. It was James. She didn't answer, but he kept calling again and again. After the fifth ring, she turned off the sound and tried to calm down. But a few minutes later, she heard a knock on the door. Sarah's heart sank. She knew who it was. As she approached the door, she heard his voice. "Sarah, please open up," James said, his voice quiet but desperate. "We need to talk. I can't do this anymore." She didn't answer. Her fear grew stronger with each passing minute. She knew that if she opened the door, nothing good would happen. "I know you're there, Sarah," he continued. "I just want to talk. I love you." The words no longer sounded comforting. They were full of pain and threat. Sarah quietly moved away from the door, trying not to make unnecessary sounds. Her hands were shaking, and she felt that she was losing control of the situation. She knew it was time to act, otherwise this would never end. The next day she decided to seek help. The situation was getting worse with each passing day, and Sarah realized that she could no longer continue to live in constant fear and anxiety. The stress had consumed her completely, making her unable to think or function normally. The fear that haunted her in every aspect of her life had become unbearable. James, who had once been her support, her mentor, and her lover, had now become her nightmare, one she could not escape. She decided it was time to take action. Sarah went to her university counselor and told him about the situation. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She needed protection. Just a short time ago, she was confident that she could handle this on her own, but now she knew that her safety was at risk. The university couldn't ignore such allegations, especially given the growing attention to issues of sexual harassment and violation of boundaries between faculty and students. The counselor urged her to contact the police to document the harassment. The police took her statement seriously. The officers, after hearing Sarah's story, offered her a temporary restraining order that would keep James at bay. Sarah agreed, knowing that it could be the first step to her safety. But even with the order, she knew James would not stop. His obsession was so strong that neither legal action nor common sense could stop him. The order was just paper, but she hoped that perhaps the fear of the law would deter James. Meanwhile, James continued to lose control of himself. His life was completely falling apart. At work, more and more people began to notice his strange behavior. Students discussed his changeable mood and his disappearing lectures. Colleagues wondered why the once stable and respected professor had started to skip classes and spend less and less time at the university. He became distant and uninterested in his work. His thoughts were only about Sarah. Every day was a struggle for James. He couldn't focus on his responsibilities. His world was consumed by thoughts of Sarah. He didn't know how to live without her, and the thought was tearing him apart. Everything he once considered important, his career, the respect of his colleagues, the recognition of his students, was meaningless. His inner world became chaotic and dark. Every minute without Sarah felt like torture. There was no room in his head for rational thought or to try to comprehend how destructive his actions had become. When Sarah filed a police report, James was even more upset. He saw it as a betrayal of the highest order. It was a sign to him that she had turned her back on him completely and was now willing to use the law against him. This fueled his anger and despair even more. He felt cornered, and every step Sarah took to protect her felt like a challenge. The police warned James about the existing warrant, but he didn't take it seriously. He believed that their bond was so strong that no legal restrictions could separate them. The warrant was just a formality to him, an empty symbol of bureaucracy that could not prevent him from getting Sarah back. James began to visit her house more and more often, despite the warrant. He continued to follow her, trying to catch the slightest chance of meeting her. Sarah became increasingly paranoid. Every rustle, every unexpected sound on the street made her flinch. She felt like she was losing control of her life. Even when she was at home, behind closed doors, she couldn't shake the feeling that James was somewhere nearby, that he was watching her. One night, as Sarah was walking home, she noticed that the door to her apartment was ajar. She froze, her heart beating twice as fast. Everything inside her screamed at her to leave, to call the police, but fear paralyzed her. She took a step forward, slowly opening the door. The apartment was silent, but something was wrong. Her intuition told her that she was not alone. As she entered the apartment, her gaze fell on something that made her stop. James stood in the center of the room. He looked haggard and dejected, his eyes full of despair and pain. In that moment, Sarah realized that her worst fears had come true. He had come for her. He had broken the warrant and entered her home. This was the moment she had dreaded for so long, and now she was about to face it. James looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He didn't speak. He just looked at her with a look of desperation she had never seen before. His eyes were full of tears. He looked like a man who had lost everything he had ever had. Sarah felt a cold sweat run down her spine. She knew that this moment could be the last of their relationship, and perhaps of her life. The situation was reaching its breaking point. It was all there in that moment. Years of suppressed emotions, shattered dreams, and fear of the unknown. James was on edge, and his behavior was becoming more and more unpredictable. He approached Sarah slowly, his hands shaking, his gaze fixed on her as his only source of existence. His voice was quiet, but there was a deep pain in it. Sarah knew she was alone. No one could help her at this moment. Fear and determination were fighting inside her. She didn't know how it would end, but she knew this was the moment her life depended on. When news of what had happened to Sarah and James began to leak out, the university community was in shock. No one could believe that such a situation could happen among respected faculty and students. At first, everything seemed like rumors, devoid of specifics. But soon the reality of this tragedy became undeniable. Every corner of the university was abuzz with talk about what had happened between James Henderson and Sarah Miller. And the consequences of this incident began to spread like ripples after a stone is thrown into the water. Students who had once seen James as a talented and charismatic teacher now discussed him as something frightening and threatening. Some began to recall his sudden mood swings over the past months. Students who had once admired his deep knowledge of literature and his ability to inspire now saw him as a man consumed by his own demons. Many who had attended his lectures began to recall moments when James seemed lost, inattentive, or even aggressive. These small details, which had previously seemed insignificant, now added up to a terrifying picture. The talk was particularly loud in student circles. Some students claimed to have suspected something was wrong with James and Sarah long before the incident. They recalled Sarah becoming increasingly distant, her behavior changing, and her avoidance of her classmates. Those who had previously considered her an excellent student and a model student now saw her in a different light, as the victim of an adult's obsession caught in a deadly trap. There were also those who accused Sarah of dragging James into this situation. Discussions began in chat groups and online that perhaps she had pushed him into the relationship, using her position as a student to manipulate him. These accusations, although unfounded, became part of a larger discussion, and this only made the situation worse. Students and teachers were divided into two camps: those who supported Sarah and those who believed that James was a victim of his own feelings and manipulation by a young student. James's colleagues were shocked by what was happening. Many of them found it hard to believe that the man they had worked with for so many years could be at the center of such a scandal. Some of his colleagues openly expressed bewilderment and condemnation, claiming that they had never seen anything in him that could hint at such behavior. But there were also those who noticed that James had changed in recent months. His behavior was becoming increasingly unpredictable, and his absorption in his own problems was becoming obvious. The university leadership, having learned about what had happened, found itself under enormous pressure. The incident had not only shocked students and teachers, but also raised concerns about possible legal consequences for the institution. The leadership understood that the matter was not limited to the personal problems of James and Sarah, but also affected the reputation of the entire university. The media began to actively take an interest in the situation, and the university was forced to issue an official statement where they expressed regret about what had happened and assured that the investigation would be conducted thoroughly and objectively. Meanwhile, Sarah's parents were devastated. They had never suspected that their daughter would be at the center of such a horrific incident. To them, James had always been just another teacher whose name they had heard Sarah mention when discussing her studies. Now they saw him as a threat that could cost their daughter not only her peace of mind, but possibly her life. They actively demanded punishment for James and protection for their daughter. The local press did not ignore this story. The news that the respected professor was at the center of a scandal involving a young student caused a strong reaction among the city's residents. Newspaper and online articles were full of headlines about what happened within the walls of the university, which has always been considered a stronghold of culture and education. Journalists tried to get to the bottom of it, to find any details to cover the situation from all sides. The reports were filled with speculation, hypotheses, and interviews with James's former students and colleagues. Many of the former students who had graduated from the university a few years earlier began to recall their own interactions with James. Some described him as obsessed with his subject, deeply immersed in literature, but also distant and cold toward his students. These descriptions only added fuel to the public debate about his character. Rumors, speculation, and unfounded assumptions spread quickly, turning James into a symbol of the downfall of a teacher who could not resist his own demons. The police also came under intense scrutiny. Their actions were scrutinized in light of protecting Sarah's rights and upholding the law in relation to James. A restraining order that had been issued earlier had been breached, and this became a key factor in the investigation. The public began to demand tougher measures, as well as a thorough investigation into how James could have indulged in such behavior and how those around him had failed to notice the warning signs sooner. Some of James's colleagues began to recall small details that had seemed insignificant before, such as his frequent discussions with Sarah outside of lectures, or his sudden mood swings. Some argued that, in hindsight, these details could be interpreted as early signs that something was wrong, but at the time, no one paid any attention to them. Everyone saw James as a respected colleague who was dedicated to his work, and they could not believe that he could become a threat to a student. Meanwhile, psychologists and behavioral experts began to speak out about the situation, debating the topic of professional ethics in relationships between teachers and students. The case prompted discussions about the importance of respecting boundaries in such situations and how easily a respectful relationship can slip into unhealthy attachment and obsession. Many pointed out that universities should take stricter measures to prevent such cases and suggested additional ethics training for teachers. The whole scandal had reached unprecedented proportions. James, who had once been known for his professionalism, had become an object of condemnation and contempt. His life, which had recently seemed successful and meaningful, was now in ruins. He had lost the trust of his colleagues, students, and society. He had become a symbol of how easy it is to lose control if you don't stop your obsession in time. For Sarah, it was a torturous time. Her life had been turned upside down. What had once been part of her normal student life was now a nightmare she couldn't escape. She felt a constant sense of fear and anxiety. Even with police protection, she couldn't shake the thought that James was still out there. Every piece of news, every rumor only increased her anxiety. She realized that her life would never be the same again, and she would have to live with this fear for a long time. The story of Sarah and James was a true tragedy that revealed all the dark sides of human emotions, from love to obsession, from passion to destruction. The events unfolded with such force that no one could predict how they would end. But one thing was clear. This story would leave an indelible mark on the lives of all participants, as well as in the memory of the entire university community. The events between James and Sarah led to the inevitable, a trial. It was one of the most high-profile cases to unfold in Portland in recent years. The situation itself seemed both tragic and terrifying. A professor once respected by his colleagues and students was now accused of stalking and threatening the life of his former student. The case became a central topic of discussion at the university, on city forums, and on local news. Sarah, despite her inner terror and exhaustion from the constant attention to her person, agreed to participate in the trial as a key witness. Her testimony was key to convicting James of violating a restraining order, as well as stalking and threatening. She understood that this step would be painful, but despite everything, she wanted to achieve justice and put an end to this nightmare. James, on the other hand, was a near-destroyed man when the trial began. His face was drawn and his eyes reflected the sleepless nights and despair. He had been in custody since the warrant violation, and this had only made his condition worse. He could not accept that he was now fighting not only himself, but also the justice system, which was demanding justice for his actions. His lawyer tried to portray him not as a criminal, but as a man suffering from serious mental and emotional problems. The defense insisted that James was incapable of controlling his actions while in a deep emotional crisis. The trial began with the presentation of evidence from the prosecution. Prosecutors presented text messages that James had sent to Sarah in the weeks leading up to the incident. These messages showed clear signs of obsessive and compulsive behavior. The court was shown how James initially attempted to reconnect with Sarah. Then his tone became increasingly aggressive and then desperate. Prosecutors emphasized that James had repeatedly ignored police warnings and breached a restraining order by continuing to follow Sarah and threaten her safety. Sarah, when it came time to give evidence, pulled herself together and walked into the courtroom. She knew she would have to face James again, but she was determined to tell her story. When asked to describe the last months of her life, her voice shook, but she tried to speak clearly and confidently. She told the court how their relationship, which began as professional, quickly became personal. At first, she said, everything seemed right and normal, but then James began to act excessively jealous and controlling. Sarah described how his behavior became increasingly alarming and how she tried to end the relationship, but he wouldn't let her. She detailed the late-night calls, how he stood at her door begging to talk and then threatening her. At one point, she broke down and cried as she described coming home one day to find James had broken into her flat, trespassing. The courtroom sat in silence as she told her story. Many found it hard to imagine how someone they knew as a kind and intelligent teacher could turn into an obsessive stalker. But her testimony was so clear and detailed that the court was left with no doubt that James posed a real threat to her. James's lawyer tried to build a defense around the idea that his client suffered from a mental disorder brought on by a severe emotional crisis. He argued that James was unable to control his actions because he was under severe stress and depression. He tried to portray him as a victim of his own demons rather than an aggressor. The lawyer insisted that James needed psychiatric help, not prison. To strengthen this line of defense, the lawyer called in several psychologists and psychiatrists who gave their opinions on James's state of mind at the time of the incident. They claimed that his behavior was caused by severe depression mixed with emotional instability, which led to his obsessive stalking of Sarah. The psychiatrist described him as a person who had lost control of his emotions and acted in a state of passion, which, in their opinion, required treatment, not punishment. But prosecutors were not lenient. They stressed that despite James's possible mental state, his actions posed a real threat to Sarah's life and safety. Prosecutors argued that he knowingly violated a restraining order and, despite his mental state, committed crimes that could have ended in tragedy. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom grew. Each new testimony, each new detail of this horrific case only increased the awareness of how complex and tragic this story had become. Issues of mental health and responsibility for one's own actions became the basis for many discussions in society. Finally, after much debate, it was time for the verdict. The judge, after hearing both sides, found James guilty of stalking and violating a restraining order. He also took into account the opinions of psychologists and psychiatrists who argued that James needed treatment, but he could not ignore the fact that his actions had created a real danger to Sarah's life. The verdict left many with mixed feelings. James was given a prison sentence with the option of treatment in a specialized hospital for the criminally insane. It was a compromise between the fact that he was punished for his actions and that he would receive the help he needed. But for Sarah, it was not a complete relief. She knew that even behind bars, James was still a part of her life. His presence, his obsession with her, would remain with her forever. The process was over, but its effects would be felt for a long time. Rumors and discussions at the university did not stop. James's colleagues had mixed feelings. Some believed that he got what he deserved. Others pitied him as a person who was trapped by his own emotions. The students finally lost trust in the teacher whom they had previously respected and admired. Sarah, despite the trial being over, still felt like her life was ruined. She tried to return to normal life, but the experience left deep scars in her. James became her eternal shadow, and even knowing that he could no longer harm her physically, she could not rid herself of his psychological influence. The process became a symbol of how obsession and boundary violations can destroy people's lives. The trial, like the story of Sarah and James, left deep scars on the lives of all involved. But even though the trial was over and the verdict was handed down, it was never truly closure for anyone. The aftermath of this tragic incident continued to linger behind them like shadows that could not be shaken. For Sarah, trying to return to normal life was not easy. Her daily life was inextricably linked to memories of James and how their relationship had degenerated into a nightmare. She felt cut off from everything that had once brought her joy and peace. University became torture. Every day she was confronted with the consequences of the past, the whispers of her classmates, the disapproving looks of her teachers, and the pain of her life being ruined. Even after James's conviction, she could not shake the anxiety and fear that permeated every aspect of her existence. After the trial, Sarah decided to temporarily leave university. She needed time to recover, not just physically but emotionally. She moved in with her parents, hoping that living outside the city would help her find inner peace. However, even away from the university, the memories of what had happened haunted her. She suffered from constant anxiety attacks and nightmares in which she relived her fear of James over and over again. In search of help, Sarah turned to a psychotherapist. She needed not only to understand past events, but also to learn to live with their consequences. The specialist helped her realize that she was not to blame for what happened and that her fears were well-founded. The recovery process was long and painful, but gradually Sarah began to find the strength to move on. She understood that living in fear does not mean living at all, and despite all the difficulties, she was determined to regain control of her life. Meanwhile, the university couldn't just forget about the incident. The leadership conducted an internal investigation to understand how such a situation could have happened and what measures needed to be taken to prevent such incidents from happening again. New programs on ethical conduct and student protection were introduced to ensure that no faculty member could ever again cross the line like James had. However, the atmosphere at the university remained tense. Many faculty and students felt uncomfortable knowing that someone they respected was capable of such behavior. James, incarcerated and undergoing psychiatric treatment, became a symbol of the downfall of a man who could not cope with his emotions. His obsession with Sarah, which at first seemed like a deep attachment, turned into a destructive force that destroyed his career and his life. Inside the psychiatric hospital where he was being treated, James continued to struggle with his inner demons. He was no longer the respected teacher he had been known for. He was a shadow of his former self. James knew that he could never get back what he had lost, and that his life was forever tied to what had happened to Sarah. In the letters he wrote but never sent, he tried to understand how things had gotten this far, but he had no answers. Sarah's family also never fully recovered from the ordeal. The parents felt guilty for not noticing their daughter was in danger sooner. They constantly blamed themselves for not being able to intervene in time to protect her. Even when James was convicted, their pain did not go away. In their eyes, this process not only ruined Sarah's life, but also became a source of constant anxiety for her future. They feared that this experience would stay with her for the rest of her life, preventing her from trusting other people. However, despite all the difficulties, Sarah did not allow her past to completely take over her future. Little by little, she began to rebuild her life, one step at a time. She returned to university a year after the incident, but chose a different department where no one knew her story. This move allowed her to start over with a clean slate, without the pressure of those who knew about her past. Sarah also started a blog where she shared her experiences and gave advice to those who had faced stalking and psychological abuse. Her story became a source of inspiration for many women who found themselves in a similar situation. She spoke openly about her feelings, about how difficult it was to cope with the experiences, but at the same time emphasized that it is possible to recover and start a new life. Her blog became popular, and she received many letters of support from people who thanked her for her courage and sincerity. Despite all the difficulties, Sarah found the strength to continue living. She was no longer the naive student she had been before meeting James. The experience made her stronger, although it left deep wounds. She realized that even after the darkest periods, you can find the light and recover. James, serving his sentence, rarely heard from Sarah. He was no longer a part of her life and he couldn't bring it back. But one thought continued to plague him: what their future might have been if he hadn't let his obsession ruin everything. The thoughts were empty, meaningless, but they wouldn't leave him, turning into a painful cycle of regret. Thus, the story of James and Sarah ended with a bitter aftertaste. It was a story of love that turned into obsession, a story where boundaries were violated and the consequences were tragic for all involved. It is a reminder of how easy it is to lose control if you don't stop in time, and how important it is to be able to let go, even if it seems impossible. Sarah, having gone through all these trials, became stronger, but the price for this strength was too high. This case became an example for society of the importance of boundaries, respect, and healthy relationships between people.